And let's move to the next talk, which will be given by Sarah Grand-Clément. And it is my pleasure to introduce her today. She is a researcher in the Security and Technology Program at the Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Her work examines the intersection of technology with conventional arms, exploring both the challenges and threats that technology can pose to international security, as well as the benefits it can bring to prevent violent conflicts and enable peace. Prior to joining United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, Sarah was a senior analyst working on defense and security policy issues at RAND Europe. She holds MC in Arab World Studies from Durham University. In her talk today, titled Artificial Intelligence Beyond Weapons, Applications and Impact of AI in the Military Domain, Sarah will examine the strengths and limitations as well as current state and near future capabilities of AI systems in the military domain beyond autonomous weapon systems. Let's welcome Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you also to Christian and all the other organizers for inviting me and for having me here today. Just a few words about UNIDIR, because I'm quite sure probably not many of you are familiar with us, but we're an autonomous institute within the United Nations. We're a think tank, essentially. We do research on different types of weapons and issues, from nuclear, conventional, gender and disarmament, and of course security and technology. And so today's presentation will be on the issue of AI beyond weapons. We'll hear a lot about AI and weapons later, but I also wanted to help you understand, that even though within the UN, the use of AI in the military domain to date has been very much discussed within the context of the UN group of governmental experts called the GGE on emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems, laws. Really, the application of AI goes beyond just looking at weapons. And laws is also extremely specific and does not capture these broader applications and potential applications of AI in the military domain. So it should be also noted, and I know I'm really going into the specificities of UN processes, but I think it's really important to understand that these discussions, the GG on laws, takes place within what we call the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, and this approaches discussions from a very international humanitarian law perspective, and also it's not inclusive of all member states. So it's also an avenue where we do face some limitations and constraints to these discussions. And really, we need to also go beyond. I mean, IHL is extremely important, but we also need to go beyond, and I'll talk a bit about some initiatives which are taking this a step forward. And within the UN, I mean, of course, the GG on laws has been the place where AI embedded in the military domain, specifically in weapon systems, has been discussed most. It's also been raised in another process, which is called the Conference on Disarmament, but this has been mostly in informal settings or meetings, and AI or emerging technologies does not really feature as a permanent agenda item of the Conference on Disarmament. However, we have seen a change or an initiative to really examine AI in the military domain more broadly by states. And two main initiatives, one I think which was mentioned by Professor Benjo. So we have one which is responsible AI in the military domain, which is HRAIM', and the other is a political declaration on responsible military use of AI and autonomy, which is US-led. And they will no doubt be discussed at length throughout the 2 days, so I will not go into them now, but it's just to say that there has been this increasing understanding by states that there needs to be an examination of AI in the military domain more broadly, beyond just within lethal autonomous weapons discussions and beyond the narrow tasks of target selection and target engagement. So this was a really long preface to the kind of presentation, and really that will be the aim of my presentation today, which is examining AI applications in the military domain more broadly. And this is based on a fairly recent UNIDIR research study, which I conducted on this topic. So I'll go through kind of three main points. First, to understand AI in the military domain, one must have an understanding of what is the military domain and what is the military context. So, what is a military operation? What is it comprised of? So I will break down some of these elements, and I will also be simplifying them quite a lot, so do bear with. Then I'll move into provide an overview of the applications of AI which already exist or might realistically exist and could be applied to these military kind of tasks. Then also provide a sense of perhaps limitations that we are confronted to when thinking about AI use in the military domain. And then finally, I'll touch upon the implications of AI applications in the military domain. And these implications mainly focus on the use of AI beyond weapons, but as the analysis uncovered, there are a lot of overlaps between the issues that we found looking at beyond weapons and those that have been previously discussed when it comes to application within weapons. So first, taking a look at the elements of a military operation. The use of weapons is really only one instance in a conflict. There are many other activities that take place that form a military operation. As part of the research, I defined and focused on 18 military tasks, which I divided into 4 functional areas, which you can see on the screen. And I'll go through and explain each of these in turn. I should also note that I refer to these as upstream tasks to kind of denote that they happen before target selection and target engagement, which I view more as downstream tasks. So first we have what we call command and control. I'm sure you've seen that term before, and C2. And this really refers to the decision-making aspects of a military operation. And here I focus primarily on the analysis elements in support of military decision-making and planning rather than those pertaining to the conduct of military action, as really my purpose was to go beyond weapons. But of course, under C2, you would also have engage with a target as not just undertake target analysis. You would also have the extra step. Here, I outlined 8 military tasks. Yeah, the font is big enough. But to go through it quite briefly, these are obviously closer to the downstream elements. You have undertake target analysis, so identifying the most relevant targets, obviously abiding to IHL, determining the choice of weapons and weaponeering. So basically, you would have a kind of, you would choose the weapon based on the kind of effects you want to have. You would also seek to assess weapon capabilities and effects. So what would be, the munition fragmentation pattern, depending on what type of weapon you're using, what might be the secondary effects of using such a weapon. What would, you could also estimate protection, collateral damage, risk mitigation, including non-strike entities. So calculating, for example, civilian patterns of life to avoid civilian harm. You could also delve into time of attack to choose an attack which is least likely to cause civilian harm. Develop mission implementation plans. So for example, identification of courses of actions and pathways. Plan for contingencies. So if something goes wrong, what would be plan B, plan C? Plan and adapt maneuvers in the battlefield based on available information, intelligence, and data collected in real time from various domains. Warfare doesn't just happen on land, it can happen in the air, maritime, not space, but or at least there's not no lethal use in space, and cyber domains, and then continuous impact assessment of the campaign, and here also including assessing public opinion. The second task is information management, which refers to collecting, processing, exploiting, and disseminating of information related to a military operation. And here, 7 tasks were kind of drawn out. Data is hugely important, as we've already heard. So a lot of the tasks deal with kind of cleaning and filtering and fusing the data that's been collected through ISR techniques. analyzing this data, also analyzing capabilities. So what capabilities could we then deploy, could we then use in the context of the previous task I mentioned, analyzing the environment. So it's, again, you can see some similarities. There's some overlaps between the tasks. They do speak to each other. Synthesis of key points emerging from the analysis of data collected, dissemination of information. Of course, you have a lot of different types of military personnel across different domains, so you do need to get that information across and through the chain of control, and management of information and communication security. The third military task is logistics. Logistics refers to the movement, supply, and monitoring of personnel and equipment to sustain a military operation. Without logistics, you just simply can't undertake a military operation. It is essential to have kind of the correct logistical support in place, and that includes both kind of equipment, but also people. So here there are two main tasks. The first is, thinking about the material. What do you need to acquire? What do you need to plan in terms of transport to different locations? What do you need to do in terms of force protection? And also just staffing, rotas, managing the base of operation, etc. And finally, the final task is training, and that refers to the instruction and preparation of military personnel. And here, the main task is undertaking training and simulation, so preparation, essentially. So this was a really quick run through different kind of elements, different military tasks that you could expect to see. It's not exhaustive, but hopefully it gives you a pretty good picture of the complexity of kind of a military operation. And the aim of the research was really to generate a better understanding of what AI can do and how these capabilities can be applied in the military context. And the kind of results were, or the outputs were drawn from discussions with experts and coming to an agreement about kind of their different perspectives on what AI capabilities exist for these different military tasks. Of course, there were divergences. There wasn't always agreement between the experts, depending on where they sat, about either what would be palatable or what would be kind of usable, or where the stage of development is at. So it's quite interesting. And in the report, there is a lot more kind of information. Here, due to time, I'll be only taking you through some examples of what was said. And before I kind of show you a few of those snapshots, I just want to say that often when there are discussions of AI being used in the military domain, these applications tend to be mentioned in quite general term. So here the intention was really to help, this report was mainly aimed at member states, but really help them to encourage kind of specificity and help them understand exactly what are the types of applications. And to do so, I examined both AI capabilities which are currently feasible, although that was in 2023, so probably some things which you may see are no longer quite accurate, and those which could be feasible in the near future, which approximately could be the next 8 to 10 years. Again, probably things have moved since the report, so do bear that in mind. And here I should just note that references to current capabilities pertain to the state of play and technical feasibility of AI, and not the level of adoption of AI. So just to be clear that it's not level of adoption. So I'll go through 2 of the tasks with you, but then I don't have the time to go through the 18 tasks. There's many other things to be talked about. So apologies that it's going to be quite a quick run through. But essentially, looking at the first task, which is undertake target analysis, and falls under the C2 command and control area, we can see current AI capabilities that experts agreed were kind of, feasible at the time, which included network mapping to identify targets based on, for example, pattern recognition, calculating and assessing interdependencies between targets. So if you, go to, target A, what then are the consequences, identification of individuals and objects via different points of motion of points, bodies, systems of bodies, and patterns of life, or via image recognition. And then in terms of feasible and near future AI capabilities, we can see the experts agreed that there would be some improvements and also slightly novel capabilities that they anticipated. Most notably, the possibility of using AI as an assessment aid as to whether the selected targets abide by the stated objectives, desired effect, and rules of engagement. And this really requires an ability to interpret an action according to set parameters. AI could also be used in a predictive capacity, notably as regards an opponent's behavior in a particular context. And AI could also provide several courses of action or recommendations. Most notably, you'll see the final item in the feasible near future capabilities, which notes that AI might be able to provide initial and rapid legal evidence as first opinions. This was quite a controversial point within the expert group. It was stressed that this would not replace a military legal advisor. Every operation needs a military legal advisor to advise as to whether something abides by IHL. And indeed, the reason why this was so debated was because legal and regulatory frameworks are contextual, and some argued that even in this near future, in this 8 to 10 year time frame, AI might not be able to kind of have this contextual understanding necessary to be able to apply legal and regulatory frameworks to a specific kind of military action. Another task, because I mentioned the importance of logistics, and I also wanted to move away from, or show you kind of a different element of a military operation, is task 16, which is logistical support of deployment, which falls under the logistics functional area. And here we find again capabilities related to the analysis of the environment, for example, analysis of routes, paths, and transport modes, provision of recommendations, assisting with scheduling of staff, automated planning, etc. So really ensuring that things can go as smooth as possible. Within a base, it could also moderate or provide an overview of optimal or desired energy utilization. So as you see from here, the application areas are a lot more removed from the battlefield, but are nonetheless still very necessary. And then you can see in terms of future abilities, it's more about predictive maintenance needs. So how can we ensure that our equipment is, functioning? Do we need to repair? Do we need to acquire, more stocks or replacement parts, etc.? This was a very quick run through. It was only 2 of the 18 tasks, but hopefully it gave you a sort of snapshot of the range of applications that AI could have within the military domain beyond just weapons. However, I do want to go into some other important kind of aspects which maybe would not have come through so clearly from those tables. So first of all, that was of course illustrative. There are probably a lot more AI capabilities as well as a lot more military tasks. And I also mentioned the time element. But thinking beyond just this mapping, it's also important to understand the relationship between this and the broader military, defense, and security context. The mapping did show that there was a range of AI capabilities which are currently technically feasible or might be in the future potentially feasible. However, and as I did stress, the existence or future existence of these capabilities does not necessarily imply or mean that they will be integrated in the military domain or in a military operation. Indeed, there can be a number of barriers regarding their implementation that may mean that although a capability may exist in a laboratory setting, actually that capability or even tested, it may not actually be introduced into operational use. So there's a really important difference between the articles that you see about states or other actors private sector actors developing certain capabilities, and that does not necessarily imply that they will ever be used in operational use. And these barriers include, but are not necessarily limited to, well, first, of course, reticence from use by military personnel. Secondly, AI doesn't just happen in a vacuum. As you're all very familiar, you need to have the necessary enabling technology and infrastructure in place to enable the application of AI capabilities. So, for example, you need continuous data if you're undertaking this in a military operation. So you need to have sensors in place. You need to have sufficient computing power and other ICT infrastructure. It may be all well and fine if you're in kind of your headquarters, but if you're out on the field, you need to consider like how does that work, in practice. And not only that, but you also need to consider the fact that you need an interconnected and interoperable system or systems. And this also entails having the necessary structures in place when it comes to the data needed, not only for use, but also for training purposes. And here, it's important to know that militaries tend to be quite fragmented. They don't operate necessarily holistically. Domains will, as in, the land, air, navy, they will operate very differently. They all have their own processes, and multi-domain operation is still a work in progress. So I think it's really important to understand that. And then also just, there are finite budgets. They need to encompass a wide range of military equipment and other priorities. That doesn't just include AI. There's also another point that is quite important to bear in mind is the overall lack of transparency and knowledge base. We're seeing, and this is in two ways. First is generally the people who develop these technologies, so commercial and marketing, or commercial and private sector industry, they often are selling a product, so they will use marketing language of how AI could be or is used, but this is obviously to sell a product. It's not necessarily independently verifiable how an AI system will work once applied. And this is in addition to the difficulty of knowing exactly what capabilities are embedded in armed forces. Of course, national security considerations play a very large part in whether or not a government will be giving this information, but it also means that it hampers understanding and can affect confidence building between states as well as with civil society more broadly. So just to say that just because I showed you the capabilities, that does not mean we should expect to see those applied. And also we need to bear in mind that what we do see and we do know is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of unknowns in our knowledge of AI use in the military domain. Basically just be critical about anything that you read about the use of AI. Okay, so now I'll move on to the final segment of my presentation, which is assuming that AI is, despite these uncertainties, we also need to think, and we do need to think, regardless of whether or not AI capabilities will be applied, we do need to think about the impact of their actual or potential application in the military domain. And of course, there's both positives and negatives. So I'll start first with, what are the possible strengths and opportunities that is generally argued when, we're talking about the integration of AI capabilities in the military domain. Well, first, of course, the ability to help improve, just help with data, whether that's data sorting, data analysis, helping with planning, accuracy, situational awareness, decision-making, etc. So basically just helping deal with masses of data. Also linked to the increasing amount of data that we're collecting and the data that needs to be sorted, classified, just increased use of sensors, other data collection mechanisms. We also need to think about, Could the use of AI help lead to a faster assessment of such data than by human means? And could that help increase the pace of analysis and thus decision-making during a military operation? And it should be also noted that increasing the speed of decision-making in upstream tasks, because of course here I'm talking beyond weapons, when we talk about downstream tasks, and I know other speakers will touch upon this, but we often talk about sensor-to-shooter timeline or the OODA loop, and I'll come back to OODA. But here, if we're looking at beyond weapons, we also need to consider if we're embedding AI in all of these upstream processes, upstream tasks, what might be the knock-on effect on the downstream tasks? A lot of the focus has been on knock-on effects within, or like impacts within the downstream tasks, but less so on understanding the full spectrum of AI within the military domain or a military operation. So to illustrate this, more granular multi-domain analysis of data and courses of action, could it enable or speed up subsequent decisions regarding target selection and target engagement? Equally, better logistics, could that mean that then the timelines are also compressed in that sense? So, also another strength and opportunity is that AI can assist with or complement strategic level planning and development of tactics, such as through the development and use of scenarios and other gaming or red teaming capabilities. And AI could also help with cybersecurity issues and could offer a kind of basically just reduce the risk of data poisoning and data inference. And then a final one is, of course, I'm sure that this is something that has been mentioned before, but the use of AI to kind of reduce human labor for tasks which are kind of dull, dirty, dangerous, and basically enabling task optimization and remove personnel away from these ancillary tasks. However, for each of the strengths and opportunities, there are also challenges and limitations to bear in mind that emerge. And here I broadly categorize them into three buckets, but I would probably not say that they're individual buckets. They're more like Venn diagrams and have a lot of overlaps with each other. So first kind of bucket is externalities that affect the proper use of AI. So of course data is a major one. Data issues can hamper the efficiency and accuracy of AI systems. And in the military domain as well, data is a particularly challenging issue. And I think this is something I will touch upon in the next talk I'm part of. So I won't really go into much further detail, also conscious of time that I'm slowly running out of. And really, just the issue of both good quality data and just data in general is to be noted within the military domain. Then there are concerns about AI in and of itself. Recurring discussion point within the kind of international security field is this black box and this issue of lack of transparency of AI decision making. This has been particularly discussed with regard to autonomy in weapon systems, but the issue was also brought up when it came to use of AI beyond weapons and focusing on kind of non-lethal capabilities. And indeed, a lack of understanding of how an AI has come to its conclusions and how it has decided whether or not something is of importance has a large impact when discussing application of AI to aid with identification of targets, collateral damage estimation calculations, or even undertaking preventive maintenance of military equipment. And overall, this can make it harder to contest solutions proposed as the basis for them is not understood. Then the second in this bucket, but third on this slide, is the question of human control. And this is pervasive across all tasks. This is also not a new element when it comes to discussing AI. When it comes to upstream tasks, there are questions specifically regarding to the extent to which the analysis, the conception of pathways for action or tactics could and should be done by AI, and therefore if and when to include meaningful human control. And more broadly, and this is perhaps more of a rhetorical question, are there tasks for which there are greater ethical, legal, and other imperatives for human control? And are there tasks for which meaningful human control can be seen as hampering the efficiency of AI, or where there might be a greater lenience or acceptability of use of AI? And therefore, what might be the repercussions when we examine the downstream tasks? So those related to target selection and target engagement. And then reasoning capability is another challenge. A number of limitations can be brought up here. You're all very well aware of them, but given the rise in LLMs, I'll probably touch upon that specifically, and particularly talking about the issue of hallucinations, and how this can affect kind of the interpretations of data or the invention of a kind of a wrong output. Of course, there are many more aspects that could be discussed here. Then the third bucket is the negative impacts resulting from the use of AI. I mentioned that AI could help with cybersecurity, but equally, AI also increases vulnerability to cyber attacks because simply there's an increased number of digital platforms, which therefore increases the risk. Over-reliance on AI could also be a problem. Many different angles to this as well, whether that's only thinking about data that needs to feed into AI systems, or only thinking in terms of the inputs needed by an AI system, rather than just thinking more broadly in terms of what are the needs of a military operation, or bringing in more rigid thinking on boundaries about what a machine can do versus what a human can do. Skills degradation in humans may also result from the use of AI. This is also a fact that's been discussed when it comes to use in weapons and other instances, in the aviation domain, for example. And also another kind of transferable challenge from kind of weapons to beyond weapons is the fear that utilizing AI would generate a faster operational tempo, so essentially exceeding human ability to keep up with events. But also I would note that this is also context dependent because it's not a one-size-fits-all, essentially. There are some situations of deliberate targeting. There's sometimes where it's broader battlefield dynamics. So really, the operational tempo one is one that can't really be just taken at face value. It needs to be understood according to the application. There are also challenges raised with regards to military operations conducted jointly by different actors, and whether AI is interoperable between these different actors, and that for many different reasons. For example, just thinking about NATO, that's this one example of where you have different types of military actors who then would need to decide altogether of what is acceptable for one country and maybe more acceptable, another country maybe less acceptable to use AI. What are the different kind of application areas, if they have different ways of calculating something, if the outputs are different, what then? So there's a lot of questions then if you're working in tandem with partners and you're using things or the outputs are different, what happens then? And of course, unknown impact, which also could apply to the strengths and kind of positive aspects. There's just some things we just don't know what the effects might be, and I think we need to keep an open mind on that as well. Okay, so in 2 minutes, some final reflections. First, I think we need to take a measured and realistic approach regarding AI capabilities and their impacts in light of both where the technology is, the infrastructure that enables the technology to perform, and the realities of the military context. What we anticipate that AI can help with needs to be kind of understood around these limitations of AI adoption, both from a technical standpoint as well as from the perspective of military technology approval and adoption. Second, inferences on the impact of AI in the operational domain, operational tempo is a recurrent one. However, I would say that unless humans are completely removed, all of these processes from all these processes, ultimately, the operational tempo will still be determined by humans and their role in the OODA loop, so observe, orient, decide, and act, which is used in the military domain. So that is something to bear in mind, that faster tempo is not necessarily a given. Third, the impact of AI on the upstream military tasks shows many similarities, as I mentioned, in the discussion pertaining to downstream tasks. And as I also noted, the inclusion of AI in upstream tasks would have an impact on the downstream tasks as well in the broader conduct of a military operation. Hence, we really need to look into AI in the military domain more broadly and not just looking at its use in weapon systems. Penultimate point, we need to consider how operationalization of AI in upstream tasks may be in some cases less controversial for decision makers than their inclusion in downstream tasks, and whether that may be a factor in making the integration of AI in the military domain more likely. Of course, these may not face the same legal and ethical issues and impacts, but it's nonetheless important to consider whether they are less visible and whether people see it functioning well, then that may not increase appetite to use AI in other tasks. And so basically, what are the possible repercussions? And really to close, and I know that there'll be a future panel on governance, but really AI capabilities related to both upstream and downstream military tasks should be reflected in discussions on AI governance and responsible AI. And to some extent, I think that member states are recognizing this within these discussions. Thank you very much for your attention. Apologies if that was a bit long and such a rapid tour through everything. Happy to answer any questions if you have any. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the talk. So we'll take a few questions, maybe starting with the first one online. So one person is asking, what is your sense of the opportunities and limitations militaries are most excited about and worried about of the ones you've listed?
Well, I'm not in the mind of militaries, and I would also argue that we shouldn't take militaries as homogenous and thinking the same. Because there will be different appetites to use AI, and indeed we're just not seeing the same discussions everywhere. And for that, I would also note that in governance discussions, the same set of countries tend to be represented, and we really don't have a lot of representation from the global majority countries. And this, I think, is a big issue. So that was just the first point. But I think there's a lot of discussions just generally about just, especially the use of AI looking beyond weapons, but really in decision support systems, and that is where a lot of the conversation is kind of moving to right now. Of course, discussions with regards to AI use in logistics is not as perhaps as seen as a greater importance because it doesn't have direct implications generally for kind of IHL, but we're already seeing countries embedding AI to help with kind of logistics, whether that's kind of helping navigate ships, or use in navigation purposes for robotics, so uncrewed systems. So yeah, that's
Let's take one from the room.
Okay, works now. My name is Paul, and thank you so much for your presentation. If I could, I have two questions. The first is, how is your research potentially conditioned, the task that is, by what we call in the military context levels of war, so tactically, operationally, and strategically, right? So tactically, battlefield operations, raids, patrols. Operationally, we're talking about integrating operations across time and space to achieve intermediate military objectives, and then strategically, essentially linking ends, ways, and means. What does all that mean for your research? Are these tasks potentially conditioned at these different echelons of war? And then the second question, if I could, is I'm not sure if you're familiar with the 18th Airborne Corps and Maven Smart System, but a decision support system that I guess apparently has optimized workflows, personnel, and so forth across especially targeting. What have you gleaned from that in terms of your research? In other words, were you predictive for what AI may have results for in terms of operations, or did you learn something that you missed out on in terms of your analysis?
So can you repeat that second question? I didn't
The
quite
18th
understand.
Airborne Corps and Maven Smart System, are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you learn anything from the operations that have been written about recently in Ukraine as it relates to your research? Thanks.
I'll start with the second question. So this was, obviously, there are some constraints with regards to undertaking research, and that while we did look at ongoing military operations, the problem is verifiability of the data. And that's also why I said this is, even though we're saying articles which are like, okay, like use of Palantir, for example, has enabled X, Y, and Z, it's hard to verify what actually happened. So we took some of that with a pinch of salt, but we also didn't, even though we used a kind of recent events as a baseline, we didn't specifically do a deep dive in any of them across the board. Yeah, in terms of the first one, the military tasks, it was quite hard to come to like a fairly coherent whole, and I did at some point consider whether or not to go and classify them by exactly kind of, tactical, strategic, operational. But ultimately, I thought that for a non-military audience, that was probably a step of analysis too far, so we just stayed at the task level, but indeed there would be differences in terms of AI application, because what you would see at like the tactical would be very different to the strategic in terms of the kind of, first of all, the type of, I'm sure you know this way better than I do, but in terms of the type of kind of tasks that they're undertaking, the data that, or the rapidity at which they need the data to undertake, to have a decision. So yeah, it would be quite different. But that would be a really interesting next step in the analysis, now that we have the tasks.
Yeah, and I just offer, you're absolutely correct, right? So we have a chapter forthcoming where we talk about AI and logistics. And what we find is that it may provide efficiencies tactically, but the complexity of operations in the strategic context in terms of humanitarian versus large scale ground kind of operations requires potentially more human oversight at the strategic level than tactically.
I'll follow with an online question. So there's one that asks, what are the opportunities and risks of using a single general AI system that is non-specialized or fine-tuned versus multiple task specialized systems for upstream tasks?
Don't quite understand the question.
I think it's asking about using general purpose AI systems versus specialized systems for upstream tasks. What are the opportunities?
We didn't look at that in the research, so.
Should I go?
In person, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So you mentioned these 4 categories, I think, command and control and information gathering and training and logistics.
Going back.
Anyways, I was just wondering, is this like a standard breakdown, or is it something you introduced in your
This
research?
was just made for this research.
And you mentioned like these upstream things might be like less controversial, subject less scrutiny. I guess, are there any other ways in which you think it's important, like sort of, I don't know, pragmatically to distinguish between these different areas in terms of like, let's say legal issues or something like this? Like, is there some way to, use this type of a distinction to predict like how strong the barriers might be to adopting AI systems and giving them maybe more control over the decision making or the operations or whatever?
So with these tasks, they were mainly a way to ensure that, because when member states discuss use of AI in the military and in UN processes or UN discussions or related, they talk about it in very general terms. So these tasks were a way to break down where exactly they might expect to see AI, and therefore what they need to consider when they're talking about AI in the military domain. It's not just this kind of amorphous application. So it was really to help them really get a grasp of where AI is included. So that's kind of the first one. But in terms of the level of risk, of course, there's different risk and there's different implications for IHL. Yeah.
So actually, I didn't. My question wasn't so much about the level of risk as to like the barriers that might exist besides like sort of public scrutiny. Like if there are any legal barriers that might apply uniquely to some of these areas versus others, or other sort of like institutional barriers.
Yeah. So that's related to risk because it also is a military operation needs to abide by kind of international humanitarian law, IHL, and so if there's, the logistics would presumably, if you include AI to help improve, processes, staff scheduling, that wouldn't have theoretically, an impact on civilian harm, undue civilian harm. But then it's kind of, when you're talking more in terms of decision support or which information is how it's analyzed, what is decided as being important, and then that has repercussions on the use of lethal force, which then impacts has negative impacts on civilians. Then yeah, you would have more kind of more focus on those applications of AI.
Thanks.
We'll take one more online question and one more in-person question. So the first one asks, what kind of expertise were included in your research, and what perspective would you say are missing, and were human rights and humanitarian organizations included?
Okay, I published this over a year ago, so I can't quite remember all the perspectives included, but it was pretty diverse. We had folks from the UN, we have private sector, we had researchers, of course people involved in AI development. I can't quite remember if we had people specifically from human rights and humanitarian organizations. I would have to look back, quite frankly, but it was to bring different perspectives together. And we had people from the military, of course. So yeah, the intention was to bring different groups, stakeholder groups together and thinking about where we might see AI applications.
Thank you. And one last question, if you can keep it short. Thank you.
Certainly. Hi, Tim from the Australian National University. Just thank you for your presentation. I noticed a couple of times you talked about the different domains of conflict, where land, sea, air, cyber, etc. In your research, did you see that there was much difference between the different domains? And I'm specifically kind of thinking here between the physical, like land, sea, airspace, and like the non-physical, so like cyber, electronic warfare, cognitive, and the difference in terms of risk between those domains or even opportunities?
I'm afraid we didn't look into the domain specifically. It was kind of, we did take into account that AI had applications cross-domain, but we didn't do a deep dive into the individual domains.
Thank you.
Let's give another round of applause to Sarah.